Aloha, everyone. So how has the memory of eugenics and the continued legacy of eugenics and anti-eugenic measures helped shape the Pacific Islands? We're delighted to gather together today to consider these questions. In this panel, eugenics, disability, and transitional justice in the Pacific. And our symposium is part of the larger From Small Things Anti-Eugenics Initiative. I'm Raphael with the Review of Disability Studies at Center on Disability Studies at the University of Hawaii at Manoa. And by way of a quick description, I have curly hair, wearing glasses, have some facial hair, and a blue and patterned shirt with a blazer. It's my honor today to introduce our distinguished panel, and I'll go ahead and do that. Julianne Anesi is Assistant Professor of Gender Studies at the University of California, Los Angeles. Hilary Stace, researcher on Aotearoa, New Zealand disability, political, and feminist history. And the Indigenous educator, researcher, and rights advocate, Dr. Scott Avery. And Huana Hiki was originally scheduled to join us, but unfortunately can't be with us due to illness. Without further ado, let's jump into our first speaker, Julianne Anesi, and I'll take a moment to introduce her. Julianne is Assistant Professor of Gender Studies at the University of California, Los Angeles. Her research interests include disability and indigeneity, educational policy, and decolonial feminisms. She's also a community educator and activist. She's worked with nonprofit organizations and schools in American Samoa, California, Hawaii, New York, and Samoa. And in addition, let me just bring here, Julianne's work has appeared in many venues, including Disability and the Global South, Women in Social Movements in the United States, 1600 to 2000, and Disability and Society. And she's currently working on a book manuscript, Tautua, Women's Disability Activism in Samoa. Welcome, Julianne.
Thank you, Raphael. Aloha, everyone. Thank you for joining us today. Can you all hear me? Hopefully you have captions on as well. So thank you so much. First, I want to just acknowledge our organizers for this symposium. Thank you to Benedict and his team, as well as to my panelists and to our moderator for bringing us all together today. So I am zooming in from the land of Tongva and Gabrielino peoples, or AKA known as the Los Angeles Basin here in California. So I'm going to share my screen, if that's okay, here to kick us off. And let me know if you can see that. Yeah, can you see that? Okay, so thank you. So eugenics is a scientific, erroneous, and immoral project that's often racially focused on improvement of communities, peoples, and various places around the world. Logics of eugenics supported the scientific racism, the justification of colonialism and imperialism project, extraction of natural resources, the justification, the destruction of land, and displacement of communities in Oceania and around the world. For folks, for Indigenous people with disabilities, this also meant social death from kin and communities. So I also just want to pause for a second and describe myself for our folks that may be joining us audio. So I am a Samoan woman with dark black hair. I have tan glasses on, brown eyes. My hair is in a bun. And I am wearing a black and white shirt with long earrings, black, they're charcoal earrings. And yeah, so that's me. So for our discussion today, I'm going to be focusing specifically on, very briefly, sort of these logics of eugenics that set the foundation for how we think about education systems, right? And then sort of pivot that over to thinking about a resistance and a kind of refusal to these logics of education, this idea of educatability, and how many communities, especially Indigenous communities, and I'm specifically focusing on Samoa, on schools that were organized by mostly Samoan women in the 1970s, in resistance to these logics around who is worthy of an education. So, and also just how these logics are animated, right, within our institutions and so forth. So my focus on schools created for people with disabilities is specifically centered in the independent state of Samoa. Likewise, also just thinking about the roles of practices, policies, and ideologies as they carry over to institutions. And here I'm thinking about schools, asylums, state schools, and carceral spaces. Logics of disabilities oftentimes intersect with race, gender, class, and sexuality, as well as ableism. So I want to kick us off here with just some questions that kind of guide this inquiry. So who is educatable? How has the history of eugenics influenced our education system? And here I'm specifically thinking about our K through 12, and how do we change the system and structures of exclusion within our own community? So the notion of educatability is tied to logics of eugenics. The debate in the 1960s and 1970s, whether people with disabilities, mostly severe disabilities, such as Down syndrome, cerebral palsy, autism, quote unquote, mental retardation, or MR, are educatable. This is the debate that drove many parent groups, advocates, and educators to advocate for an education of all children. The professionalization of fields like psychology and psychiatry then became the authorities in making the decision of whether education is legible to these groups, particularly groups of in the disability community. Since the ideologies of education and law seem to push for change, the person to qualify for protection under the law oftentimes was this myth or long wait around systems and structures to change. And so the argument within the disability community has been that if we wait for the person with a disability to change, they will never get service, right? So this is the kind of push to deinstitutionalization movements and to think about changing systems and structures in order for these marginal communities to receive services. So changing these normative attitudes and ableist practice in education is where social activism and social justice emerge and later theorized in the field, right, of disability studies. So for our time together, I want to focus on some very specific critical categories here or terms of analysis from a disability studies lens and also from a Samoan studies, Pacific Oceania studies lens in thinking about our understandings of disability and of education. So ableism is one of those categories of analysis that disability studies and activists have long used to think about who is valuable within institutions and within these asylums, schools, etc., right? How do we think about ableism as a system of assigning value to people's bodies and minds based on societally constructed ideas of normalcy, productivity, desirability, intelligence, excellence, and fitness? These constructed ideas are deeply rooted in eugenics, anti-Blackness, misogyny, colonialism, imperialism, and capitalism. This systemic oppression leads to people in society determining people's value based on their culture, age, language, appearance, religion, birth, or living place. This idea of quote unquote health and wellness, as well as the ability to satisfactorily reproduce, excel, and behave. And more importantly, you do not have to be disabled to experience ableism. So this is um, a running definition of ableism by scholar and activist T.L. Talila Lewis, in thinking about how do we situate these systems, right? Additionally, we also think about the concepts of normal, normate, and the norm, right? So here, there's a long history here, and Leonard Davis, a disability scholars, investigates what this kind of cultural shift in thinking about the origin of statistics, right? And here he specifically focuses on French statistician Adolphe Quetelet, in which contributed mostly to a generalized notion of the norm as an imperative, right? So this is where we have standardized tests, we have the bell curve come into play, and also the relevance of the division of students based on their education aptitude, and how kids are oftentimes divided within the education system. And I think we also understand from different fields such as special education and as well as urban education that racial students of color and various divides very much are based on these kind of standards and logics of how kids should be educated. And mostly studies have also found that kids with disabilities are often students from communities of color, as well as those who are from urban communities, and oftentimes labeled as disabled or oppositional defiance, or there's some sort of emotional label or diagnostic that's attached to them. So these kind of foundational understandings, therefore, of disability and education is very much at play within how do we think about who is educatable, right? Quote unquote, this term. And so much of this work has also simultaneously been critiqued by many scholars. So here I think about Stephen Jay Gould's work, that's Gould, who also extends this discussion by examining biological determinism, right? Or the claim that worth can be assigned to individuals and groups by measuring their intelligence as a single quantity. And here I'm thinking about the long time usage of craniometry, the measuring of your skulls, and the psychological test, and how people are often categorized, but also as often placed within society. So what I want to pivot to here lastly is to thinking about these very big sort of influential overlapping concepts, and how communities have resisted, right? So here I think about um, thinking about schools. And so part of my work has been looking at schools specifically in Samoa, independent Samoa, and schools that were created for students with intellectual and physical disabilities in the 1970s, and understanding the women who organized these schools, and their kind of understandings of disability in how people can refuse, but also thinking about this concept of community knowledge, right? So how do we resist these ongoing legacies of eugenics within structures and systems of education by using sort of community knowledge? And here specifically, I'm thinking about the concept of tautua, which oftentimes is traditionally within the chief the chiefly title aspects of the concept within Samoan culture. But the women who organize these schools assert that tautua, or service, loosely translated, is about their responsibilities, is about their alofa, or love and care for others. And so there's a kind of humanity and collective good in thinking about this sort of relational and political approach to disability. And so the women within these schools establish bilingual education, which is both in English and in Samoan within the schools. They implemented various foods, and we all know what you eat also very much affects you, and many studies have come out with various allergens that children have to foods, so implementing and cooking with local ingredients, and also this kind of relational aspect that the women fostered with local businesses, but also using familial ties and social and cultural practices within their community to really think about creating schools that very much fit the needs of Samoan children. And so thinking here about the concept of indigeneity, right? How do we take that logic and think more specifically about it? And so finally, I want to just end with our kind of complicity in these systems and how much of these logics are very much embedded, but also normalized, right? So the idea that it is the way it is not the way it is. And so for the sake of time, I think I'll stop there and we can kind of hash out these understandings around complicity, but also replicating of some of these logics around collective care and politics. So thank you. And these are just photos of the schools. So thank you, everybody.
Thank you, Julianne. And next, it's my pleasure to introduce Hilary Stace. And Hilary, you're there?
Yes.
Yeah. And I'll take a moment. Let me introduce you. Hilary's research interests include, excuse me, Aotearoa, New Zealand disability, political and feminist history, including the history of eugenic public policy. And she was among those who advocated for an inquiry into historic abuse of disabled people. And her presentation is a brief look at the current Royal Commission. Thank you, Hilary. I'm going to go ahead and turn it over to you.
Kia ora koutou. I'm from Te Whanganui-a-Tara, Wellington. I'm an older Pākehā woman. I wear with glasses, and I've got a purple jacket and a pink scarf. And I'd like to thank everybody who's organised this amazing hui, and I'd particularly like to tautoko to Huhana, who is an expert on all of this and just unfortunately can't join us today. In Aotearoa, New Zealand, the Royal Commission of Inquiry into Abuse in State and Faith-Based Care is finishing its 5-year investigation into historic abuse between 1950 and 1999. Started by former Prime Minister Jacinda Ardern, it is the biggest inquiry in our history, and its final report will be delivered in March next year. A public hearing specifically on historic abuse of disabled people was held in July 2022. Many more have given private evidence. The road to the Commission was long and bumpy, and many had called for an inquiry for decades. Institutionalisation of disabled people in Aotearoa, New Zealand started over 100 years ago and peaked from the 1950s to the 1970s. Deinstitutionalisation began slowly following a 1973 government report, and the last big institution closed in 2006. But eugenic assumptions about disabled people remain in many contexts. Stories from those with the lived experience of state care shine a light on our history of eugenic-based public policy, our toxic history of colonization, racism, ableism, and eugenics over the last 150 years is still playing out today, particularly for poor, brown, or disabled people. Getting the concept and word eugenics into the Royal Commission's work has been a little victory. Many were wary of such a label, but it was obvious that eugenic views were influential for much of the last century. And in this talk, I'm using many of the eugenic words at the time, and many are now, of course, offensive. Eugenists or eugenicists, optional, saw disability, mental unwellness, poverty, and addictions as inherited moral failings, as well as non-white ethnic groups as inferior. Therefore, the breeding of all these groups must be controlled to prevent them from polluting the fit. These false ideas about genetics and morality represented cutting-edge science of the day and were widely held by political, academic, medical, and religious leaders in our country. An influential 1903 booklet, The Fertility of the Unfit, by a local doctor and politician, W.A. Chappell, was a eugenic tract in which the writer encouraged the fit, meaning white people like him, to have more children and to sterilize the unfit, meaning those with impairments or who were poor. For much of the 20th century in New Zealand, as elsewhere, eugenic-based public policy portrayed disability as something feared and shameful. Disabled Maori children were at high risk as they were caught in the intersection between colonisation and eugenics. In more recent decades, with immigration, Pacifica children were caught up too. We now know that all types of abuse and neglect was widespread in these institutions. In New Zealand, the major eugenic legislative tool was the 1911 Mental Defectives Act, which I've heard has had similar acts around in different countries. This classified groups of disabled people into 6 categories: persons of unsound mind, mentally infirm, idiots, imbeciles, feeble-minded, and epileptics. Each label had a specific meaning which indicated how they should be controlled and surveilled. This act remained in force for 50 years. Public prejudice about feeble-minded men and women led to a 1925 inquiry into mental defectives and sexual offenders, which reinforced the links between intellectual impairment, moral degeneracy, and sexual offending in the public mind. Dr. Gray, head of the Department of Mental Hospitals, wanted children and adults with intellectual disability or other conditions to be registered and sterilised and sent to segregated farm colonies. Under his influence, the 1928 Mental Defectives Amendment Bill proposed sterilisation. After much political debate, sterilisation was rejected as a result of advocacy by opposition Labour MP, later Prime Minister Peter Fraser. His was a rare voice against eugenics, possibly because of his own family experiences of mental illness. So even though eugenic sterilisation was never legalised in New Zealand, anecdotally, we know operations and contraception without consent were very common. The Mental Defectives Amendment Act led to the establishment of Templeton Farm Mental Deficiency Colony near Christchurch in 1929. Over time, more of these psychopedic, i.e. specialist child disability hospitals and units were established, and there was also a network of residential special schools. A 1953 report recommended extending the existing psychopedic institutions into large mental deficiency colonies, with parents encouraged or coerced to send their disabled children to them by the age of 5. It didn't say coerced, but that was the implication. These recommendations were made despite pleas from parents and the World Health Organization support at the time for community facilities instead. As a result of this 1953 report, the institutions were extended and numbers of residents rapidly increased. By the 1970s, thousands of disabled children, young people and adults lived in such places. A new inquiry in 1973 recommended their closure, but that took another 30 years. It can be hard today for many to understand the fear of and discrimination against disability. Conditions that we now group as neurodivergent in those days were shameful and signaled that families had possible genetic and/or moral failings. It must have been very hard for a mother pressured to send her child away. But common assumptions were that such removals were for the best and children would be with their own kind. We know from testimony to the Commission that many disabled children were exposed to physical, emotional, psychological, and sexual abuse, witnessing and silencing, heavy medication, and sometimes medical experimentation. Institutionalized children were disproportionately Maori. Many also suffered from cultural and spiritual segregation from the iwi, their tribal affiliation, language, and heritage. Basic neglect without personal possessions or any choice in daily activities was standard. Many families in whānau have a story of an institutionalized family member, and there are remnants of old institutions and unmarked graves across the country. The inquiry is considering how to provide redress, which I think is the same concept as transitional justice, for the horrors of that its hearings have brought to light, as well as what is already planned as an official apology and an ongoing listening service, a restorative justice listening service. To honour those who suffered under eugenics, I would like to see more. I would like to see official gathering of stories, not only of disability abuse, but of activism and success and celebration, and official collecting an official archive. All these types of redress will also help Aotearoa New Zealand confront the remnants of eugenics that remain as widespread systematic ableism. Unfortunately, with the recent change in government here, I fear that the Commission's recommendations will be ignored. Our new government, that's not quite together yet, but having the discussions, has policies of boot camps, building more prisons, and attacking gangs. The inquiry has shown clearly that these policies are linked to historic abuse. One coalition party has policies which are both eugenic and racist in their assumptions that some groups are less deserving than others. So 6 years ago, there was hope that a long-awaited Royal Commission would lead to significant redress. But things are looking more doubtful now. But we can't let the fight for transitional justice slow. So we'll have to fight in different ways. And have been really interesting listening to all the presentations so far today. There's so much commonality. There's so many similar histories and similar battles and similar things that have happened. There's so much that we can work together on. You know, there's such potential here for collective action. So yeah, that's my assumptions of, that's where we are at the moment, and it's all a little bit uncertain where we're going now. But the Royal Commission has provided some absolutely incredible information, shocked so many people. It's had quite a bit of media attention, but it's just, you know, the whole thing of things could repeat. There really has to be such a big effort to improve things and also to provide that justice for people and families, from survivors, those who haven't survived. And also it's a stain on all of us from Aotearoa New Zealand. We let it happen. We have to do something. That's why we would like an apology from the top so we can all apologize. If we can start again and say, look, we're sorry for doing this terrible thing, for letting these things happen to our children, to our people, to our colleagues, to the people in our communities. So yes, not quite sure what's going to happen, but I think the idea of transitional justice is hugely important, and all those things, and the work that Benedict's doing is very relevant to New Zealand too. So thank you.
Thank you very much, Hilary, and thanks for bringing attention to these common threads. And I hope we can come back to that later in this session. Next, I'm very pleased to introduce Scott Avery. Dr. Scott Avery is an Aboriginal educator from the Worimi people of New South Wales, Australia, who is profoundly deaf. His research is on the experiences of First Nations peoples with disabilities, which has been influential in the Royal Commission into violence, abuse, neglect, and exploitation of people with disability, and national and Indigenous and disability policies. So Scott, welcome. I'm going to go ahead and turn it over to you.
Good Yigu, which is hello and welcome in my native language of Gatang. Thank you for the warm introduction. I'm an Aboriginal man. I am currently on Dharawal country, unceded territory of Aboriginal people. And as is customary, I pay respects to elders of my nation, the Worimi people, where I am on Dharawal land, and the traditional owners of the lands on which you are all today watching this. So I actually have a presentation that I'll go through. It just helps me now just in describing it. So I'm an Aboriginal man. I'm a deaf person from the Worimi Nation. You can't see me, but I've got these, but I've actually got cochlear implants. In terms of my general appearance, I have a scruffy beard and a face that masks the wear and tear of being advocate for Aboriginal people with disability for a few decades. So I'm just going to walk through today. So the previous speaker, Hilary, spoke about a Royal Commission that is mooted for New Zealand. In Australia, we have just completed a Royal Commission, and it was a 4-year inquiry. So what I'm going to focus on in mine is the how this Royal Commission and the Indigenous knowledges, what contribution the Indigenous knowledges in highlighting the trauma and experiences of First Nations people with disability. We talk it more as a structural violence, as a sort of parallel term to eugenics that's used in this, the structural violence that has been inflicted upon people. So if I can just, I'm actually out Western Sydney, but for those who want to look for me, you've got me on my last day here. As of next week, I'll be at the University of Technology of Sydney, where you're going if you're looking for me. And just for the benefit of many of the participants here, through it, I have embedded a lot of Aboriginal artwork that has quite detailed meaning, so I won't go into each explanation, but each of my slides, a lot of my slides have Aboriginal artwork attached to them. And I feature an artist by the name of Uncle Paul Calcott, who's an Aboriginal man with disability throughout. So just for the benefit of those, that's what this artwork is. So acknowledging that I am on Aboriginal land and pay respects, this image is one from the centre of Australia, with the sun setting on the centre of Australia. And I choose this one because a lot of my work where I speak with Aboriginal people, the centre of Australia, many of the Aboriginal nations out there were very generous in sharing their wisdom and experiences that have contributed to the knowledge of this presentation. So very much a spiritual home. So I just want to start with this idea of an Indigenous culture of inclusion if you want to understand how Indigenous people in this nation, and I have seen it in other nations, Maori people, in Native American people, and even in the Pacific nations, an Indigenous culture of inclusion. And to set the frame for this, we tell the story. So out in Western New South Wales and Australia, there is an archaeological site, and it has embedded footprints of the clay, and it's dated back 25,000 years. And what it shows is this community, and they're on a hunt together. And amongst it, there is a single right line of footprint. So it's right footprint, right footprint, right footprint, no corresponding left footprint. And we tell this story because no one actually knew what it was. You know, the Western archaeologists didn't know. And so they went and actually asked the Aboriginal elders, and the community members said, well, that's a one-legged man and they're on a hunt. And we tell this story of inclusion because he actually was. They went back and measured it, and they said, yeah, the footprints are there. He's actually on the hunt. He's participating in a community activity. He's valued and respected. And we tell this story to show the value, an Indigenous cultural value of inclusion, where people are respected for their inherent worth that they bring to community. And so it's like we take all comers. We often would say there is no word for disability in Aboriginal languages, in that regardless of whether it's a perceived ability or disability, people are respected for the roles and knowledge that they bring. So very much an ecological viewpoint where everyone has a place and purpose on this earth. Now, that Indigenous culture of inclusion was disrupted through the process of colonisation that commenced within Australia in the late 1700s. And it started off, so the architects of colonisation wanted to create this particular world, they called it Enlightenment, paradoxically, and it had a different set of values. It imported a social hierarchy. And it sort of said, you know, look, if you're an Aboriginal person or a person with disability, at this time, the Industrial Revolution was commodifying human people and making them part of an industrialized, streamlined process. And if you weren't part of that industrialized, streamlined process, you were othered or unable. And so this philosophy or ideology of economic contribution dominated. It actually coincided with this thing about, well, let's establish this utopian society in what was then known as New South Wales. And so it was the imposition or importation of a social order that accompanied the dispossession of land for the Indigenous people. So if you're a First Nations person and you have a disability, you're dispossessed from your land because the colonisation was asserted through violence. Aboriginal nations and people were removed from their land through violent means. If you're a person with disability, you're also dispossessed from your body, because one of the early things that was introduced into Australia were the institutions of asylums and incarceration. So the two images you see there are early images where special prisons, incarceration prisons, were created to remove Aboriginal people from the land. If they resisted, they were put into prisons. And the bottom one you see is a very early day asylum. And so what happened was people they wanted to separate people who did not fit the norm and pick people up who had what we would now know as mental illness or epilepsy or things like that, and or intellectual disability, and they were housed away from society in the asylum. So you see this twin kind of process of othering if you happen to be a person with First Nations person with disability. So this has actually been this process of control, seeing colonisation as an enduring process of control. This has morphed in various stages over 250 years. So as I speak about the asylums, you know, they're actually given a very odious name, idiot houses, back in the early 1800s. But if you have a look at something like the function of juvenile detention centres, and you have a look at the high prevalence of Indigenous people with disability incarcerated, put away from society, you see that whilst the name has changed, the function of othering and removing people from society as a function of social engineering that's happened through colonization. And so what you see, if you're an Indigenous person with disability, you're encountering two forces coming together. You experience racism and you experience ableism. And whilst they have an effect of maneuvering people into isolation, they present themselves differently. So racism presents itself very much as a conflict. You heard me say at the start of this presentation, I'm a very proud Aboriginal man from the Worimi Nation. There are ways and means and platforms in which I can do that. But for many Aboriginal people, when doing that, it attracts the risk of a conflict. So you are attacked for it. Can be a psychological attack in terms of the name calling or an attack to your identity. You know, you don't look Aboriginal or you can't speak for Aboriginal people because you're not connected closely to a community, but there's a conflict involved. And sometimes that conflict escalates into violent conflict. So that's one expression of it. Ableism expresses itself differently. And underlying this, the ableist presentation of it, is this tacit assumption that people with disability can't speak for themselves. They don't have the capacity to speak for themselves. So it's often through that what the experience of othering is that they don't, their voice and their expression of their personal agency is suppressed. Others in systems and in positions of power seek to speak to intermediaries who will speak on their behalf. So around this is, and underlying this is this notion of a suffering. People have a suffering. So very much the kind of Christian Judeo kind of you suffer a disability. So someone like me, I might say I might suffer hearing loss. Now, that's a view that is imposed upon me. It's not my view. I'm very comfortable with my being a deaf person. I see it as I've actually gained peace and tranquility through silence. The idea of suffering is nothing. It's antithetical to me, my culture. But the ableism, if you like, creates this disempowerment of the community. So if you're both a First Nations person and a person with disability, you experience those, and occasion it intersects. So what you see is this process, a maneuvering, a life trajectory. So what I have on this screen here is a pathway, and this is the trauma pathway, the trauma story where Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people with disability are maneuvered into situations where they're isolated from society, which makes them susceptible to the violence and exploitation. These are the kind of things that the Royal Commission looked at. So it starts from birth, and what happens is you have the forces of racism and ableism, presumption and prejudice going, if you like, maneuvering it. So looking at the early childhood, people who are unable to access disability supports, the presumption is that it's part of their pathology and they're not actually given a chance to have their disability identified and supports. So that then manifests into the schooling age and a phenomenon we call bad black kid syndrome. This is where young Aboriginal people we know in our community have a disability are presumed to go, well, they're mucking up, like a punitive model. So they're actually suspended from school. They're suspended, they're removed from the opportunity to learn. And these things carry over their life. One stage of marginalisation sets a platform for future stages of marginalisation. Now, it sounds quite depressing and fatalistic here, but the key messages of this is that vulnerability is not inherent in the individual. It's a function or a product of the social forces of racism and ableism that conspire to maneuver young Aboriginal people into situations of isolation. So that's the first message. The second message is, once you see that it's not inherent in the individual, you can do something about it. You can use these pivot points in the person's trajectory to alter that trajectory away from isolation and into empowerment and inclusion. So these are the key messages, and we've actually captured this through our community-based program of truth-telling. That's what we use in the language you use in the First Nations disability community, the language of truth-telling. We reframe this as research and science when we're engaging in universities, institutions, but I think the philosophy of truth-telling is bigger than just the process of inquiry and knowledge, because it is about, I have the capacity to tell my story on my own terms. So it's more than just a creation of knowledge. It's very much an empowerment process where people who tell their story believe for the inherent worth of what they bring. So we've captured this in a book called Cultural Inclusion, which is what I have on the screen there, which embodies it. So this work was very influential in the Disability Royal Commission. So the Royal Commission that's just concluded, and you see that in understanding the trauma story, the Royal Commission, I think, has done a reasonable, very fair job, particularly in relation to the intersectional issues of First Nations people with disability. So if you look at the particular volume of the Disability Royal Commission, so chapter 9, there is an entire chapter dedicated to First Nations people with disability. And we've had a quick look, but roughly around 20% of the resources, of the references and citations are referencing some of the research that we presented in the previous slide. So it is drawing very heavily upon it. So that's what it has captured, is a trauma story. Now we need to go, what next? And where do we need to keep pushing or maneuvering? Because what we have, as there is a trauma story or a pathway into it, there's a post-traumatic empowerment pathway, so a healing pathway out of it. And there's a pathway that we can see through the process of truth-telling. So it starts with the truth-telling. A First Nations person with disability gets to tell their story on their own terms. And they would say, many people don't ask me that or give me that platform to do so. And what happens is other people tell their stories. And this is this truth-telling and not acknowledging, believing the people, not inquiring on it and testing them, we will believe this as an inherent truth. And what you see many people coming together then, and they're saying, well, your story sounds like my story. And they go, even though it's a shared experience of disempowerment or marginalization or discrimination, they go, hang on, your story's mine. And that's it. That's part of the next stage in the healing, because the system tends to isolate people. It thinks it's just you. But when people hang on, it's not just me. There's other have this experience. They come together and form a community. And we're seeing this through the truth-telling that's happening through the First Nations disability community, through the First People Disability Network and organisations like that, telling their stories. And so this is where voice comes together, because then they go, well, if it's your story and my story, whose story else is out there who haven't had the chance to tell them? And so these people find a purpose. They're going, we will use our story of marginalisation and our experience, but also what is positive around our knowledge of inclusion, our story, our value of the one-legged Mungo man on a hunt. We can bring that knowledge to going, hang on, now how do we create an optimistic future for our communities? And that collective activity moves it from a community, a personal story of empowerment to a community story of healing. So I think that's where the future is in terms of dragging forward the outcomes of the Disability Royal Commission. So with that, I would just like to say that's a very much a short synopsis of both the trauma story, but the empowerment story that will come. I would just like to say Marabou Nyanyabu, which is thank you and take care.
Thank you so much, Scott. And I'd like to invite back Julianne and Hillary. And thank you all for inviting us to think about both the horrors and crimes of eugenics, but also the refusals and the interruptions, use of community knowledge, as Julian was sharing, and the potentials of Aboriginal knowledge to transform these legacies into empowerment and inclusion, as you were saying, Scott, in truth-telling. And Hillary mentioned the importance not just of capturing the horrors of eugenics, but as also of chronicling the activism, the successes, and the reasons to celebrate. And with that in mind, I'd like to ask, if I could, ask each of you to just mention what gives you hope as some examples of interruptions and resistance that give you hope. If anybody'd like to jump in and start off.
I'm happy to start because I often think about hope, and we would see hope as an obligation in our community to hold hope. And if I might give an example of one of the people that I spoke with during the research, the truth-telling, it was an Aboriginal man in the centre of New South Wales. It was a regional town, but it may as well have been a remote one. And his story was he lived in a centre and there was so much trauma. There was young people who had died from medical neglect. There was racism, there was violence. It was kind of like this cluster of trauma. And I was speaking with him and he was telling his personal story of how the name calling, he says, the buses won't pick me up to go into town, this personal story. And right at the end, he goes, and I do use the camera, he goes, I know there's something stronger right there. We've just got to get there. And I've actually used that. And I thought, if he's a person in the center of trauma and he holds out that hope, I actually speak of hope as a cultural obligation for my community. Whenever we're doing it tough and we're feeling it, I said, we just got to keep turning up. So that's what I hold. And when I look at the knowledge of our community and the wisdom that comes, and I see people in those situations defiantly proud, truth-telling is an act of defiance. It is an act of self-determination. And when you see people do that, you draw strength from that. And I draw strength and hope from that.
And also I just want, as a historian, you're always looking back to the future. There's a whole Maori saying that captures that. You walk backwards into the future, taking all the wisdom of those who'd been before with you. I think a lot of this is you just have to take a historic view. Like last year in New Zealand, we got a Ministry of Disabled People that had taken decades to get that to make it to get that movement from the early disability rights activists from the 60s and 70s, just organizing and pushing and keeping on going, often with huge barriers and lots of going backwards again, a bit forward, a bit backwards, but over time there's always hope, collective action and hope.
Julianne, did you have something you wanted to add?
Sure. Hi, Julianne here. So thank you so much. So I think, like freedom, hope is always a site of struggle, right? So, I think for me, these oral histories are stories. And here I'm kind of nodding to, scholar Sammy Shock, who talks a lot about joy and pleasure activism as sort of a resistance to ableism and to all these kinds of barriers and logics of exclusion, right? So I really think our oral histories tell a story that is a different narrative, and I think it changes the normative narrative that I'm really excited about, in terms of thinking about what is different, but also understanding that a lot of social movements, and I think here in the US context, the idea of deinstitutionalization. So, in the 60s and 70s, the common or the normative advice that doctors would give new parents with children with disabilities was that you must institutionalize them, right? So you must send them to an asylum or a state school, etc., sort of a facility that's often away from the community. And so I think about the deinstitutionalization movement, which some scholars in disability studies consider isn't a successful movement, right? Folks have advocated, agitated, and protested those logics, which very much is embedded and ingrained in eugenics, in bringing disabled folks out of those institutions and into the community. So I think having those examples of successful social movements within the communities, I think is inspiring, that it's not impossible and that we're not just talking about the abstract, right? And the hopeful imaginaries that we have, that things that I think it to have concrete examples that these things have happened and they have changed. And they're, of course, time is always a factor, but we have these examples of other narratives, alternative narratives, and I think those are hopeful, in understanding that that's a springfield or a springboard to more things to come. So yes.
Thank you. And we really only have about 30 seconds, but I'm going to ask everybody to indulge us if I can ask you one more question. Connected to what you were talking about, are these practical ways. Any other practical, concrete ways that we might leverage the history of eugenics and towards creating these best possible futures? Just any other final thoughts on practical ways that we can invite these best possible futures?
Keep having hooey like this.
Having hooeys like this, yeah. Any other last thoughts on that?
I keep coming back to, this is not, when we talk about practical, the most practical way is to keep turning up, I guess, in places where, now there's a question online from Rob, if I might blend this, about voice. And so the Disability Royal Commission work that I spoke of coincided with another big thing that happened in Australia, which was a referendum on whether Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people should have a voice to Parliament. And I've often been in what I call the truth-telling game. And that is the telling of stories, the fuller truth of what is happening in our nation, both in terms of its history, but how it plays out today. And I think education and knowledge and awareness is one of the most practical, setting the foundation for a positive future. If people know, and people know its full history and have the opportunity to reflect of it, then I think that I think what Rob has called audience curation, putting the truth out there. And the thing that differentiates truth from the referendum or voice is we don't need anyone's permission to tell the truth. What we need to do is stand up. What is happening in Australia and possibly the world is being famous has outranked being qualified or knowledgeable. If having an opinion has outranked actually understanding and critically thinking through. And I think the most practical we can do is continue to turn up for the fight for truth-telling.
Well, thank you all so much. I want to thank all of our panelists, and I know that we're over time, but Juliana, Anesi, Hilarion, Stace, and Scott Avery for this fascinating discussion and for sharing your work. Mahalo to all of you for joining us.